All right, I'll go ahead and get going here. All right, so we'll go ahead and get going with another. Hey folks, thanks for coming for another live stream broadcast here from the Riffomonas YouTube channel, the Code Club series of videos. And what I try to do in these videos is to recreate figures that I find out in the wild, whether that's the scientific literature, the popular press, who knows, wherever I can find them, right? And so hey folks, welcome back for another episode of Code Club here on the Riffomonas YouTube channel. I think this is my third attempt to live stream a video. Let me know what you think down below in the comments or in the chat feature, what you think of this approach to presenting the same type of information. I've really enjoyed the interactivity with you, the audience, so feel free by all means to use the chat. I see Rents is here. For another episode, and so it's great to have you loyal followers, so thank you. In today's episode, we are going to be making what's called a waterfall chart or waterfall plot using ggplot2. So I'm of the Gen X generation. I was born in 1976, and so whenever I hear waterfall, I think of the iconic TLC R&B hit, Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls. And it just had this iconic video that I can still pull up in my memory. But we're not going to be talking about music videos. We're going to be talking about making plots in ggplot2 and trying to do it in a manner that fosters reproducibility. And so the article that I'm going to be drawing the plot from was published in the Washington Post. I don't have the description up right now as I'm broadcasting this live, but later you will be able to get the link to this Washington Post article, as well as a link to all the code that I'm generating in today's episode, and really encourage you to kind of play with this on your own, perhaps adapt it for data that you think would lend itself well to a waterfall chart, okay? So, again, this is a Washington Post article. It was published, I don't know when. It says it was updated yesterday, but I think this is about a month old. And I'm giving you a link from archive.is, which allows anybody to see any article that's behind a paywall for free. Don't ask me about the ethics or legality of that, but hey, who knows? And so this article was about the contraction in the US GDP in the first 3 months of 2025. It shrank by about 0.3%. And so the thought was that this was happening because there were a lot of imports where people were buying things from overseas very quickly before Trump's tariffs went into effect. I think most of those tariffs actually went into effect and then were retracted within days. So who knows? I don't want to get into the politics or economics of tariffs, but I want to get into making this waterfall plot. And so you can kind of see one variety of the waterfall plot here on the right side of the screen, but the one we're going to make is further down in this article. The article was written by Abha Bhattarari. I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her name, but this is showing the U.S. gross domestic product growth, GDP, over the past several years, right? And so we've had 2 quarters where there's been a shrink in GDP. And so this is the waterfall chart, right? And so it's called a waterfall chart, I think, because you ultimately have this final bar bringing things back to zero. It's a way to show what adds up to some total value. And this is used a lot in finance and in, like finance type stuff, money types of things, right? Where you can perhaps imagine having a whole part and then you want to show all the things that add up or detract from that calculation. And so this is the waterfall chart that I want to make. There's different categories for personal consumption, private investment, government spending, exports, as well as then imports, right? And so you can see these all add up to give a negative 0.3% overall change, okay? So I'm going to get us a larger version of this plot, not that one. Let me grab it here. I've got, I thought I had it ready for you all to see. I'm still trying to learn how to get organized for this stuff, but here we go. So this is kind of a zoomed in version of that original plot, right? And as I look at this, there's a few things that I find interesting, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and open up our studio here. And I want to make a bit of an outline of the things that I think are interesting, right? So first of all, we need to get the data. And so, yeah, it's basically going to be like our outline for this episode. So we're going to need the data, right? Which we could perhaps kind of just guesstimate, but it's always fun to go find the real data. We then have the bars, right? And so, but the typical bar plot, all of the bars would be anchored on either like the x-axis or the y-axis. And instead, they're kind of anchored, if you will, to the previous value, right? So we want to know how to make floating bar plot, right? And that's just a name that I just made up, okay? Another thing that's interesting in here are the arrows showing kind of the direction, right? So like government spending shrank, so that number got smaller, right? Whereas then imports also brought down the overall GDP, right? So these arrows, I guess, then are showing the contribution to the overall GDP, right? So government spending shrank and the imports also surged, which is counted as a negative when thinking about GDP, because it's not our domestic product, it's someone else's domestic product that we're bringing in, if that makes sense, okay? And so, yeah, those arrows within rectangles. And then there are also annotations, right? So we've got labels next to each of the bars with some text, right? So we have annotations with color and black font. And I guess it'll say bolded color and black font. The other thing that's in here that's interesting is that the bars themselves have kind of this black line connecting kind of the top of, say, personal consumption to the bottom of private estimate. And so I'm going to call those caps on floating bar plot. And then there's a variety of styling things going on here too, right? Like there's the x-axis labels have the y-axis labels have a plus sign, and they also have the percentage points, basically the title of the y-axis embedded into that y-axis. So I'll say the y-axis, styling, and also removing x-axis styling, right? The x-axis has nothing on the x-axis, right? And then we also have the title, the caption, and the, I'll say, attribution. And so there's a caption in the lower left corner here, but there's also then Alyssa Flowers, the Washington Post, on the right side, okay? So these are the things that we are going to take on in this live stream. If you have other things that you would like to see how you would do them, or if you think I'm missing something in this plot, that you think would be interested to include, by all means, let me know. But that's the goal for today, right? Is to make this plot. So if we return to the World Wide Web, and they tell us that the source was the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so doing some Googling, I found the news release for the GDP first quarter 2025. And so there's a variety of releases of these data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The Washington Post used the advanced estimate, so basically the early data. And so there have been subsequent revisions of those data to get a little bit better. The numbers don't really seem to change a whole lot, but anyway, to kind of recreate the Washington Post version, I'm going to use the numbers they used. And so they have this kind of blurb up here at the top of the news release saying to go to the newest releases to see what's there. And so they have a version of the waterfall plot right here. Let me see if I can zoom in on this for you a little bit. But basically showing all of those different categories and their overall contribution, right? But they're showing them side by side rather than as a waterfall plot, right? And so you can kind of see the different way of presenting the same information either as a waterfall chart or like this as a bar plot that looks like it was made probably in Microsoft Excel or something like that, okay? And then they have some commentary about it. So if we come into the related materials, we'll then see that they've got all sorts of information about how this information was generated and then disseminated. And so let's go ahead to full release and tables. And so again, they have the full release at the beginning. And then as we go further down, there's technical notes. I love this, that like they tell you basically how they got the data, right? And so there's table 1, which is the real gross domestic product and related measures. So the percent change from the preceding period. What we want is actually in table 2, which is the contributions to the percent change in real GDP, right? And so we see the GDP here on line 1. I know that the text is probably pretty small for you, is negative 0.3, which is what we want. The personal consumption expenditures is 1.2. And let's see, what's a big one that we can see? So like the federal shrank by a third of a percentage point, right? And so I went through these numbers, basically looking at the bolded items and created this table, right? Where we have these 5 categories with these 5 values of change, right? And so this is our data, right? And so I'm gonna go ahead and grab this link and I'll plop this in here next to data. And so we've got our data, right? And so we're going to represent this as a tribble or a tibble. And this is reminding me also that I haven't loaded my libraries yet. And so I'm going to be using the tidyverse, which is going to get us like the readr package to read in the data. Or I guess we're not reading in data. We won't use readr. We're going to be using like ggplot, tidyr, dplyr, did I say that? ggplot2. All those kind of typical tidyverse type packages are assembled together in this tidyverse meta package. And then we also have show text as well as ggtext. Show text will allow us to use fonts from Google Fonts. So we'll be using the Libre Franklin font in place of Franklin, which is the sans serif font that the Washington Post uses. The New York Times also uses Franklin, or they both use a version of Franklin. We're using a different version of Franklin. That's free, and free is a good price. And then ggtext will allow us to do things like we see here in these labels, where we have a colored text and a non-colored or black text, and then having bold and non-bolded, right? And so we'll be able to do that using tools from ggtext. So let's go ahead and load these libraries. I'm also going to add the Google font stuff and then set the resolution to be 300 dpi, and then show text auto basically makes this persist through the rest of the tool development, right? And so then if I look at this tribble or tibble, I see that I have these categories. So personal consumption, private investment, government spending, exports, imports, and the change, right? And then I've also got a save statement here to get the same aspect ratio as the original plot here, right? So if I wanted to recreate the bar plot that we saw on that website, I could pipe this to ggplot AES, and on the x-axis I could put the category, on the y-axis I could put the change, and then I could do geom_call and go ahead and save that. Right, and let me go back to my desktop and open that up. There we go. So again, this is kind of like what they had, although mine is in a different order from theirs, right? And so maybe that's something we can do here, is we can go ahead and modify the data to make category a factor to be in the order that it was originally, right? So here we could then do mutate on category equals factor on category, and then the levels will be what's in category, right? And so now if we pipe that to ggplot and save it, we now see that we've got personal consumption, private investment, government spending, exports, and imports, right? So by using that mutate factor statement, we're able to get things in the order that we want them, okay? But of course, we don't want that side-by-side bar plot. We want a waterfall plot, okay? And so there's a couple ways that I could foresee generating this appearance, right? So one would be to use like I think there's a geom polygon. There's certainly a geom rect. Yeah, there's a geom polygon. There's a geom rect geom within ggplot that would allow us to draw these as rectangles. So that's an option. The other option, which I mean, I guess as I'm thinking about this, we could also perhaps do this as like a stacked bar plot, right? Where we'd make a stacked bar plot with different categories. We'd fiddle with the order, and then we'd fiddle with the fill color to make it either like white or, you know, one of these three colors here. Both of those options seem a little too complicated for me to kind of wrap my head around this early in the morning. An alternative that I'm going to try is to represent this as a line plot, right? As a series of 5 different segments. So take a drink. You think about how I might do that. So we can think about this. I think it's most easily to see for the arrows, right? We could think of those as being segments. So like geom segment, where you'd have a X starting position, and so it's called X, the X end position, the Y start or the Y position, and the Y end position. And so giving those aesthetics to geom segment allows you to make a segment, right? And so we could, for the arrows, like we're jumping the gun here, we could make those 5 arrows like that, right? But what I would encourage you to do is think about doing the same function, but instead of using like the default line width, what if we used a really wide width for our line width, right? I think then we could get a really thick bar, right? And then we could use the color aesthetic to change the different colors, okay? So we're gonna do both of those steps, the bar for the waterfall, as well as these arrows using geom segment. The geom segment for the arrow is going to use the arrow argument, and we'll do some fiddling with that. I think it's the arrows function, or maybe it's the arrow function that goes to the arrow argument. We'll figure that out when we get there. But to do that, we are going to need, like I said, the X positions. And so the X and X end are going to be the same value, right? So we might give those like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Y position is going to effectively be kind of the cumulative sum of these different values, right? So let's go ahead and pull off this ggplot stuff because it's wrong, right? That's not what we want to do. And we'll work with this mutate statement. And so, again, what we want to do is basically get the cumulative sum of these values. So let's go ahead and add this to this mutate. I'll do cum sum equals cum sum, that's the cum sum function, on change. And so this then gives us like, let me pull this up, right? So let me shrink this a little bit and let me minimize that. And so if we think about the top, like personal consumption 1.21, private investment 4.81, so that looks about right, that looks about right. Government spending then would have been down 4.56, exports up to 4.75, overall change negative 0.28, right? So by using cum sum, we've created the y end argument, right? So I'm going to rename this to be y end. Now though, what we want is also the y position, right? And so the y position is basically going to be this, but lagged, right? Where it's going to start with an A, and the start position for imports will be 4.75. And so basically we want these four numbers bumped down one and use 0 for personal consumption for the Y position, okay? So Rents is saying there's also a waterfall package for R. I'm sure there is. And it's I think a lot of fun also to see how we can make it ourselves. So maybe sometime I'll have to go back and see how the package works and see how it compares. So we'll also do here lag on y end. And so now what you can see is that by using the lag function, we lagged it. An alternative is lead, and that moves things in the opposite direction. But we want lag. And we get an NA value here for personal consumption, right? So let's go ahead and look at the help for lag. And we want to, let's see, compute lagged or leading values in package dplyr. Let's look at that. And so lag has a default value. And so the default value null pads with a missing value, which would be NA, right? So if we instead here do default equals 0, now we get 0 for our Y position, right? So let's go ahead then and add in an X position, and we'll do 1:5 for those 5 positions across the X-axis, right? Okay, now I think we have our data. Let's go ahead and plug this into ggplot2 and make our waterfall plot. And we'll have to probably do a bunch of adjusting, but that's the fun. ggplot AES, x equals x, y equals y, y end equals y end. And then we're gonna have to come back and do the color. I should have thought about that, but we'll get that in a minute. And then we can do geom_segment. And okay, so this is our waterfall plot, right? We have a ways to go before we get to here, but hopefully you can see the similarity between theirs and mine, right? Let me put these side by side, right? And so again, here for category 1, personal consumption, you can see that line. For 2, the private investment, the government spending, exports, and then imports, right? Cool. So what I said I wanted to do was to go ahead and thicken these lines to make them a lot like what they had in the Washington Post version, okay? So we'll go ahead in here and do line width. And if we did, say, 5, we see we get thicker lines, right? So I think we're going to have to increase it quite a bit. So let's go up to 15. And so those are pretty chunky. There's a fair amount of padding on either side of their bars. And so I think if we add that padding, that might push our bars into being closer to each other. So let's try that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that with chord Cartesian, because ultimately I think I'm going to be plotting some of those annotations outside of the plotting window. I'm going to want to also use the clip argument. So let's start with expand equals false, clip equals off, and then we'll do xlim equals c. Let's do 0 to say 6. And so that's changed the limits, again, from 0 to 6, right? And so that's cool. And we can also perhaps change the y limits. So let's go ahead and change the y limits while we're thinking about these limits. And we'll do y lim equals c. Let's go from negative 0.5 to 5. Okay. And we'll probably have to change some of that limiting later. But I think we can also bring it in a little bit more as well. So let's go to like -1 to 7. And so I think that's not exactly where we want things, but it's pretty close. Now let's see if we can make those lines a little bit thicker still. And maybe let's take it up to say 20. So I think that's pretty good. That's a pretty good spacing. It's kind of close to the spacing that they had. Maybe their spacing is a little bit closer. We can adjust all this later, right? So I think that's going to be pretty good for now. One thing that is a downside of using this geom segment approach is that that this line width is measured in millimeters. I think I saw that like 0.75 line width is 1 millimeter, right? And so what would be nicer, though, that we would have been able to do with like geom rect would be to specify the exact points of all 4 corners, right? So then we wouldn't have to fiddle with the line width. But I think this still is going to be a bit easier, okay? Cool. Now let's change the color of those lines. And so to do that, I am going to bring up my handy dandy digital color meter, if I can get my dock here to open. And we'll go ahead into applications. It's in utilities down here. And again, I'm obviously on a Mac. There are digital color meter like tools on PCs as well. And so what I'm going to do is basically drop my cursor into these 3 different colored rectangles to get the hexadecimal code. So I'll go ahead and, oh, where'd you go? Okay, I'll go ahead and copy that. And we're going to need then to make a new column within our tribble, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and call this color. And I need a comma at the end there. And then in quotes, I'll put the color. And that's going to be the same color for the first 2 bars, right? And so then let's come back to get this purple color. And we'll plop that in there. And now we're going to want that orange color, which is here. Copy that. Plop that in with a comma. And then plop that in. And that's the end of the tribble, so I don't need a comma at the end here. What we need to modify here, though, is in the AES statement then, is the color equals color. And to use that actual color, actually, I see an error up here, so I need a comma right there, right? So if I were to run this as it is, I would get my 3 different categories being these 3 different colors, right? Like the names of those categories are those hexadecimals. And I get like the default red, green, blue. That's not what I want. I want this hexadecimal code to color for that, or to code for that color, right? So what we can do is back up here, I'll go ahead and do scale color identity, right? And so scale color identity will use the color that's specified in the column that I'm specifying it for, right? Good to see you, Kim. Thanks for joining. And so now when we do that, we now get those colors that I think do a pretty good job of matching the original colors in the original plot, right? Cool. All right. So those are the bars for our waterfall plot. Now what we want to add are the arrows, right? So it's going to be basically, or maybe, yes, definitely, the same thing, except instead of line width equals 20, let's do like 0.5. And then we'll use color within geom segment to override what was here, right? And so I can give it black. And that then gives us our black lines, right? Awesome. Now what we want to do is go ahead and add in the arrowheads to these lines. And so again, we'll come back up here and we can then do arrow equals arrow function, right? So let's go with the default and see what that gets us. There we go. We have our arrowheads, right? They're kind of ugly, but we can modify them to make them look better. And so their arrowheads look like they're at a 90-degree angle. So that would be like an angle of 45. So let's go ahead and do that. We can come in here and do angle equals 45. We could also do length, which takes the unit function. And let's try 5 points. And there we go. We now have our arrowheads, and they're at kind of that 90-degree angle to each other, the two kind of edges of the arrowhead. But their arrowhead's a little bit bigger. So let's notch that up a bit, and maybe let's take that up to 8. And I think that's pretty good. Maybe I'll just take it down to 7 and stop picking at it. And I think that looks pretty good. All right. One other thing so we set the line width of 0.5, and I think that does a pretty good job of matching their line width. Again, I don't want to get too into the weeds of modifying these small details until I have the overall plot in the kind of position of where I want it, because things will start moving around, and if they get smushed or expanded, then we'll have some type of distortion. Okay, cool. So that is our floating bar plot with the arrows to indicate the direction of the change, right? Cool. So if we come back to our outline, we've done these 2 steps, right? Cool. So we did this with fat geom segment lines, and then this with arrowed geom segment lines, okay? And I'll say fat colored, and then I'll say arrowed black geom segment lines, okay? So the next thing on my list of things to do is the annotations with bolded color and black font. And so as I'm looking at this though, I think I want to maybe change the order. I want to perhaps move this styling stuff of kind of the overall appearance of the plot to be the next thing I do before I do the annotations. And so here I'll also add like clear background out. And then that, I guess, also goes with like y-axis styling and things like that. Okay, so I'm going to kind of move things around. And that's the nice thing about having an outline, right? Is that like, these are the things I know I need to do, but maybe I need to change the order, or maybe I need to add something, right? So I find having an outline for writing and writing code is always very helpful. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and clear out the background. And the default theme is theme gray. And I think that's a fine place to start. And we'll basically clear everything out here now, right? So we'll do that with the theme function. And let's start with panel.grid.major. I gotta spell it right, equals element blank. So if I do that, that then removes all of the major grid lines. I also have minor grid lines in here. So let's go ahead and do panel.grid.minor equals element blank. And that removes the minor grid lines. We'll come back to this because you'll notice in theirs, they have major grid lines on the y-axis. But let's go ahead and clear out the background, right? And so then what we can do would be panel.background equals element blank. And so element blank basically is saying remove the background. And so, but what's behind the background then is the plotting window, right? So that gives us a nice white background, okay? So before I get too much farther, just want to remind everybody that I do have a newsletter that I try to send out once a week that kind of presents these same plots at like a 30,000 foot view. If I come back, this is the online version, the web version of that discussion of this waterfall plot, right? And so I posted this about a month ago. And so if you want to kind of see where I'm going with these episodes, this newsletter is a great place to go. I also have in here information about workshops and anything that I have planned here for the future. So I'd encourage you to go to riffomonas.org, where you'll find a link that will allow you to sign up for the newsletter. Okay, now let's go ahead and add back in those grid lines. And so we'll blank out the X grid lines and then do panel.grid.major, I gotta spell it right, .y equals element line. Oh my. I was working with someone in my lab yesterday morning on their R code, and basically everything I typed had a typo in it. Just like, what's wrong with my hands? So anyway, it is hard. So that didn't come up, and I think that's because the color is white for the theme gray. So let's put in here like color equals gray, let's try 70. And so that gives us a gray grid line. Those are kind of thick compared to what they have in theirs. So let's go ahead and do line width equals 0.2. And so that slims that down. We can also get rid of these tick marks because theirs doesn't have any tick marks. So let's do that next. And we'll do axis.ticks dot, all of them, right? Element blank. So that got rid of all the tick marks. Let's go ahead and get rid of the x-axis stuff, right? And so we'll do axis.text.x equals element blank. So that got rid of that. And then we have these like the titles, right? So I could do the same thing with like axis title. Let's do that. We'll do axis.title equals element blank. So I could do labs, right? I could do like labs, x equals null, y equals null, and that would get me the same thing. But sometimes it's nice to do things different, just to practice. And so that gets rid of our x-axis information and our x and y axis titles, right? Cool. Wow, thanks for joining from Bulgaria. I am not going to try to pronounce your name, but that's great. And Kim is commenting, lovely Wednesday night. So I'm suspecting you're 12 hours ahead from me and so you're probably in Asia somewhere, right? So that's just awesome that there are people from around the world tuning in. Thank you all very much for watching along. That's just really awesome. Okay, so let's now, what else did I say we're gonna do? So we clear the background out. We got in the grid lines. We removed the x-axis styling. And so now what we want to do is add the y-axis styling, okay? So if we kind of return to theirs, the thing to note about theirs is that they have a plus sign before the numbers, and they also have, for the +5, the percentage points, right? So let's come back here, and I like to keep my scale functions together. And actually, I'm going to move my scale y continuous to be just below chord Cartesian, because I'm modifying the y-axis here, right? And so I'm going to be modifying it in a different way here with the labels, right? And so let's get, I hit the wrong key somewhere. All right, that's better. So let's see, where did I go? Right, scale y continuous right there, and I wanted a plus sign at the end. All right, all's good. So now what we can do is set the breaks to go from 0 to 5, right? And then the labels, we'll do, We'll do C0 +1 +2 +3 +4, keep hitting that hyphen, and then +5. And so what does that get us? That gets us our plus signs, right? And so, but that +5, we want percentage points to the right of it, yeah? So here, let's go ahead and do percentage points. And maybe I will kind of wrap this down a little bit so things aren't scrolling off the right side of the screen. And so what we now find is that our text on the y-axis is right justified. We would like things to be left justified so that percentage points is going into the plot, right? And so let's think about our axis text y element text, and we'll do hjust equals 0, which will make it left justified. So again, we see it's left justified, but there's huge space here, right? So one thing I might think about doing is changing the margin on the y-axis text. And we can do that to move things over to the right. So Mark said, need to put an H line at the top of segments. We're coming to that. And greetings to Australia. That's awesome. Thank you all for watching so late at night. That's great. So we'll get to those caps at the top here shortly. So let's come into axis text y, and we'll do margin equals margin. And on the right, we can set a negative value to basically pull things further to the right, yeah? So if I do like -20, you'll see that things are shrinking, right? But I don't think this will work, because if you look closely here, if I zoom in on this, you'll see the line is going underneath the points, right? Whereas if you look at the Washington Post version, it stops before the percentage points, right? And so I think we're going to have to try a different approach here. And the approach I think we'll try is to add percentage points in separate from the +5. And we'll do that with something like geom label, which will give us a white background, right? And so that white background then will create a bit of a buffer between like the S and the grid line, okay? So let's go ahead and remove this percentage points. Oh, and I left in the S, so let's get that. And there we go with our 5, but we still have our margin on, right? So let's go ahead and remove that. And I think that this stuff, yep, that's right justified. So let's go ahead and make the hjust then 1, which was the default. All right, there we go. So now we have our plot with our y-axis styled. One thing I noticed about their plot is that they have a grid line here going over top of personal consumption, but behind imports, whereas the grid lines are behind everything else. I'm going to assume that that was a goof on their part, and so I'm not going to I'm not going to try to figure out how to get this one grid line to go on top of that line. But I think it's actually above the rectangle, but below the arrow. So I think that was a goof. They must have done something in Illustrator. I'm not going to try to recreate that, and I'm not going to feel guilty about not doing that. So Rens is in the Netherlands. Awesome. So one other thing while I'm looking at the text is that I haven't brought in the Franklin font text to my theming. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can set the default text for all of the text in the theming using the text argument to theme. And we'll do element text. We'll do family equals Franklin. And so now we get that Franklin font. It's a little bit bigger than theirs. So let's go ahead and shrink it down ever so slightly. And we'll do here size equals, let's try 8. And I think that's pretty good. It's not exactly the same, but maybe it's just a smidge small. So let's do like 8.25. And awesome. I'm going to leave it there. The other thing is that the text is gray with theme gray rather than black. So let's go ahead and do color equals black. And that gets us a bit crisper appearance to that y-axis text, okay? So the other thing I'll do for the x-axis is this solid black line at the bottom. And what we could do would be like axis.line.x element line color equals black. But what we find then is that that puts that down at like a negative 0.5, which was the bottom limit, right? Not at 0. So to get it at 0, we're going to go ahead and remove this, and we're going to use hline. But I want that black line to go behind my rectangle. So I'm going to call that geom hline before geom segment. So we'll do geom hline, and we'll do y-intercept equals 0, and line width, let's do 0.5 as a start, and color equals black. I think that's the default anyway. Oh, it's unhappy with me because I put a comma rather than a plus sign. I think I heard one of you all yell at me, so. Let's see, so Mark is asking, does ggplot add in layers, i.e. bring the front or rear? Yes, it adds in layers, right? So it puts things on top. So in this case, I did geom hline first before any of my segments. So it puts that down first. And then the next thing was this fat geom segment that gets put down on top of the plot, right? And then the third thing were the arrows. So we've got 3 layers here. We've got the geom hline on the bottom, and so that goes behind this imports column. We then have the fat segments here, the fat colored segments, that goes on top of that. And then the arrows are on top of that. And the grid lines are at the very bottom of everything, okay? Thanks for asking that. All right. So let's add in, what did I say I was going to add in? The title, the caption, and the attribution. And so when we do the attribution, I think we'll add back in that percentage points. So let's go ahead and get the title. And, oh, where'd you go? Okay. So this is the title, Contributions to Quarterly GDP Change in Q1 2025. And so let's go ahead and after the geoms, we'll do labs. And again, here we could have done like the x equals null, y equals null, but whatever. We'll add that title. And then caption was the source. And we'll add that in. So this third text element where it's like Alyssa Flowers, the Washington Post, is it's right justified, right? So the caption here, the source is left justified. Alyssa Flowers is right justified. So I can't do that, at least I don't think I can, in a single single caption statement. So what I think we'll do is add the Alyssa Flowers and the percentage points then as an annotation, right? And so Mark says, so if you add a text, it will hide Y major ticks. Text maybe. So you will still see that. We'll see this in a bit. I think that like if I go and add percentage points, and I could get that to overlap on top of the +5, and you'll still see the +5 under it, so it doesn't totally mask it out, unless we use something like geom label, which has a white background. Most of the like geom text stuff has a transparent background. So we can play with that here in a minute. So, so where were we with ours? Let's go ahead and render this. And so we've got our title and our caption. By default, ggplot2 puts the caption on the right side rather than the left side. By default, it justifies the title on the y-axis on the panel rather than the plot. So both of those things we need to change. easy enough to change by doing plot.title.position. We can then say plot to get it to be left justified on the plot now, right? And then we can also do plot.caption.position equals plot. And then to get it to be left justified on the overall plot, we can again do plot.caption equals element text. We can do hjust equals 0 to get it to be left justified. And so now we've got our source Bureau of Economic Analysis on the left side, as well as our title. Our title is a bit big compared to theirs. So, and it looks like their title is a smidge larger than their text. So maybe I'll start with a title size of 9. So let's do plot.title element text size equals 9. And maybe that's a little small. So let's just bump that up to like 9.5. And I think that is a pretty good font size, right? Cool. All right. And there's a bit of a space between the title and the plot. So we could add to the y-axis limit, or we could add a margin underneath the title. So let's go ahead and add that margin. I'm also going to start working on the margins that surround the plot. So let's go ahead and do margin or plot margin. And we'll do margin. And the top, let's do 10. The right, let's do 10. The bottom equals 10. The left equals 10. And of course, we'll adjust these as we go forward. And so that is perhaps a little bit too much margin on top. So let's back that off to say 8. And I think that is pretty good. And so then we need some space below that. So in plot title, we can then do margin equals margin B, and let's do 10 there. Got that extra period there. And so that then you can see add some spacing below it. I'm going to add a little bit more top margin. Let's maybe make that 9. That brings that down, and let's add a little bit more margin between the title and the plot. And let's make that say 12. Cool. I see those line up really nicely. The top grid lines are lined up really well. So I'm happy with that. If we think about the bottom margin now and that caption, the font can probably be a little bit smaller, and we don't need so much margin at the bottom, right? And so the bottom, let's take that to say 7. That brings that down. And then our plot caption, let's do size equals 8. And so I think that is good size. Maybe it could be a little bit bigger, like 8.5. Probably doesn't, I don't know if anyone cares, but I try to get these things to be really close, and I'm kind of known for that. And it should just be 8. All right. And so let's remove a little bit more of the bottom margin, and let's take that down to say 5. And that's cool. All right. So we now have our title and our caption in the right place. One thing we could do to get our 0 line to line up better is to perhaps add more limit or more space to the bottom of the plot, right? We could also, again, do that by adding margin to the top of the caption. But let's see how we can do it in this case by changing the limit, right? And so currently we go to -0.5. If we go to like -0.8, that then adds more space to the bottom, and maybe a little bit too much. So let's back that off a little bit to, let's say, like -0.75. So in Rents, you're saying your monitor on the x-axis is not black, but dark gray. So is that you running the code, or what you see for my code? So I think I got that limit. Looks pretty good. That change going from gray to black was done with this geom H line that I have up on my line 31. So, yeah. So that, now that I've got everything next to each other, I feel like my x-axis line is a little bit chunky. So let's make it a bit more narrow. And so I had 0.5. Let's take that to say 0.3. And I think that's pretty good. Maybe I'll just go to 0.4 and that'll be good. That'll be better. All right. I think that's great. Cool. All right. So while we're messing with margins, let's think about our positions of everything else, right? So the text on, so mine's the bottom, right? So I could add a little bit more margin to the left. So let's maybe up that to 13. And I think that lines up pretty nicely. Yeah. And then on the right, we could add more spacing to the right. Yeah. So let's take that to 13. And maybe we could go a little bit more up to say 16. And I think that's pretty good. Okay. So what I'd like to do here is to line up, because we're going to add in those annotations, right? I want to line up my bars with their bars. And so I think my left axis is pretty good, but maybe we should try adding to the right axis limit to effectively move everything over. Oh, so you're saying that the original image is a dark gray? Let's see. I don't know. That looks... It's the same color as the arrow, so not sure. All right, so again, we're going to add to the x-axis limit. So let's take that up to say 8. So that brings it over. And so if we do that, then maybe we need to increase the left limit now. And so we can do that. So let's go up to say 1.2. That brings that over. And maybe what I should look at are these lines and whether the arrows line up, right? And so we could add a little bit more to the left. And of course, the thickness is getting a little bit wonky, but that's okay. So this is 1.4. It's a little bit to the right. So let's maybe back that to 1.3. And I'm gonna, close enough. And then the right, maybe could have a little bit more to the right as well. So let's maybe take that up to say 8.5. Okay, that's too much. Let's do 8.2. Too much. Let's do 8.1. All right, I'm going to call that good enough. I'm not going to worry about it too much. What we need to do is then shrink the thickness of those columns, right? And so again, we come back to this geom segment where we had line width of 20. If we make that like 18, that then I think gives us nice spacing. I feel like their lines, their arrow lines, are a little bit thicker than mine. So we can bump that up ever so slightly. I've got 0.5. Let's take that to 0.6. I think that's cool. All right. So we now have our waterfall plot more or less in the same shape as theirs. There's a few things that we still need to do, right? So we need to add these annotations and we need to add these horizontal caps on the data, okay? Yeah. So let's see, kind of coming back, right? So maybe I could put little X's next to what we've done so far, right? All right, so now we're ready to do the annotations with the bolded color and black font. and to then do the caps on the floating bar plot. So do people have a preference on what you want to see me do first? So annotations or the caps? Feel free to put in the chat what you think would be best. So as you're typing that in, again, just remind you that I do have a newsletter. If you go to riffomonas.org, you'll see how you can sign up for that if you're not already registered for it. I tend to present there kind of the 30,000 foot view of how I would go about taking plots like this. I don't really show any code. I just kind of say like, well, I'd make this floated bar plot using a segment, right? And make it really fat or something like that, right? Just kind of thinking through the strategy that I effectively laid out here in this outline. Also in there, I announce workshops where you can get recordings to past workshops that I teach. And I'm this summer also going to be offering some one-on-one as well as group coaching sessions to help people with their code, as well as thinking about kind of their own professional development around coding. So if you're interested in any of that, be sure you're signed up for the newsletter, and you can also email me at pat@riffomonas.org. All right, so no strong feelings. So let's go in the order I had with using the annotations with bolded color and black font, okay? And, oh, actually, you know what? I got ahead of myself. I didn't put in these two other annotations. So let's do that first. All right, so we're gonna do both of these using an annotate statement. And that was this attribution, okay. All right, sorry. So I'm going to do this down here at the bottom, and then I will move it up so I'm not kind of fumbling through all of my code. So we'll do annotate as a function, and we'll do geom equals text, and then x, we're going to have two values, y is going to have two values, and I'm going to do vjust equals 1 to make it top justified at the xy coordinates, and then hjust equals 0 to make it left justified. Maybe I can put those two just arguments on the same line. We'll do family equals Franklin. Remember that if you're using like geom text or geom label and you want to change the font, then you have to do that within that geom or that annotate statement rather than only in the theme. The theme only changes like the titles, the axis text, things like that. It doesn't change things inside of the plot. All right. So let's start with that percentage point, and I guess I also need label. It'll do percentage points. All right, and so the Y position is going to be 5, right? Because that's at the top. And actually, maybe vjust here I want to be 0.5 because I want it to be centered. All right, and so then the X position, if we look at theirs, is basically on the left side of the plotting window, right? And so that's going to be my X limit minimum, right? And so if I come back here, I see I have negative 1.3. So let's do that. We can start with that. Maybe we'll need to change it. So let's go ahead and do that. Oh, and I forgot a comma here. And if we look at mine, we have the percentage points there. But as we saw when I was kind of tweaking, trying to do percentage points with the +5, I still have that black line through the background, okay? So we're going to want to change text to label so that we have a white background. So let's try that. And so now we have a white background, but we have this silly border, right? And let's then do what? That's going to be label.size. Is it label size? Let's try. Unit 0 PT. Yep, that got rid of the border, right? And so my font is still too big, but you can see kind of the effect that we're going for here, right? That like the grid line doesn't run through the text. So let's go ahead and shrink the font. And we want it to be the same size as our axis text Y, which was 8.25, right? So we'll come in here and we'll do size equals 8.25, and then size.unit is going to be in points. And so now that looks good. But there is a bit of padding around the text in geom label, right? And so we're using that to kind of give this effect that they had of a break between the S and the grid line, okay? And so there's also padding to the left side, right? So I'm going to need to bump mine to the left ever so slightly, right? And so we could do that with like a negative HJust, or we could change the X position. So let's go down to like negative 1.35. So that moves it over. Let's go over to maybe negative 1.5. Okay, that's too close. I think this question came up earlier, right? So if I did like negative 1.8, now we see percentage points, but it's on top of the 5. You can still see that 5 there though, right? So let's see, we did like 5. That's too close. So let's make it 4.5. And that separates it. And I think that maybe it could do 1.42. I think that's cool, right? So that's how I would go about making this y-axis label, right? Where they do the nifty thing that we see a lot with like New York Times, where they put the y-axis label actually with a y-axis text element, right? And I think that's pretty cool. The other thing that they have is the attribution to Alyssa Flowers' Washington Post in the lower right corner. So that's going to be a little bit harder to do because we're not going to have as many anchoring points, but we can use the same annotate function. And here I'm going to put in my name because I made this. So I'll do Pat Schloss. Actually, they did it in all caps, right? So I'll do Pat Schloss Riffomonas. That'll make it clear that this is my version, not Alyssa Flowers's, okay? And so then the X, we'll use the same knowledge that we had for the X-axis to position that percentage points, right? We put like 8.1. So let's put 8.1 here as well. And then for the Y-axis, again, the bottom of our plot is at negative 0.75. And that's like right here somewhere, right? So we're going to want to go down further. So let's try like negative 0.9. And again, we'll fiddle. So negative 0.9. And actually, I did HJust equals 0. And so that works well for the percentage points. But I think what I want is 1 for the Pat Schloss Riffomonas. So it'll right justify basically on the X-axis. Okay, cool. So now we see that that is right justified. There's a bit of a gap there, right? So maybe like we saw before, we could bump this over to like 8.2. I think that's good. And then amazingly, I seem to have gotten this pretty close. It could probably come down just a hair. So that is our Y. Let's do like 9.92. Oops. So sometimes when I run it and then flip the preview, I get that black screen. But I think, there we go. So I just rerun the ggSave. I think that's pretty good placement. And so that's how then I would do those types of annotations. Does labels have margins or padding? Say set left equals 0. No, it only has overall padding, right? So let me go ahead and remove this label. And so you'll see then the label, right? And you can see the border. And so what I could do would be like label.padding equals unit 0 pt. And so that brings in the padding, right? But there's not like a left or right, kind of like you might expect with something like CSS, right? And if we look at geom label, then yeah, the only argument is label padding. You can also change the radius as well as the size, but you can't change individual paddings like left, right, top, bottom, right? So Rents asks, in preparing these sessions, do you measure out the original image in advance? To get this width and height, I do. And the way I do that is, let me go into, let's see, 25. Okay. So what I do is, like, I have the original plot here, and then there's a function called file on a Mac. I don't know what it is on other things. You could also get this through like any of your image viewing graphics tools. If I do like file, waterfall, plot, original.png, I can see this is the aspect ratio, 1354 by 1308. And then I can take that, and if I know that I want a width of 6, I can do like 6 divided by 1354 times 1308 to get the height I want. And that gets me 5.8, which is what I have here. So that's the only thing I am measuring out before I start. So that's a little bit about the padding and the labeling, right? All right. So Rent says, sometimes I cheat by adding a space at the text. Yeah, so like you could add space to the front or the end. I think typically it works best to put a space at the beginning. I've had cases where the space, like a trailing space, might get stripped out. And so, yeah, there's all these little hacks that we all do. That's totally cool. All right. So I'll go ahead and comment this out. And yeah, we want that label size. Thanks for that question. That's why I love doing these types of questions. So thanks. All right. Now what we want to do is add the cap, right? So there should be a line here, here, here. And there should also be a line here and here, right? To match what they have, okay? And let's do that. So I like stalled on this because I think this is one of the more challenging elements of this figure actually, is to make those caps. And so I'm gonna come back here and do what? I think I'm gonna break this apart for right now. And so again, this was my data where I added like the X position and the Y positions, right? And so here I have X as being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because I've got vertical lines. And now what I want to draw are the horizontal black lines as those caps. And so I want to use a fixed Y. So I'm going to use Y end, right? Yep, I'm going to use Y end, but I'm going to have X and X end, right? And so let's see how we might do this. So let's start by calling this, say, data. Good generic name, right? And then let's go ahead and do mutate x end equals lag on x. And so then that gets us what? Our X position and our X end. But this is the opposite of what I want, right? Because this is like a starting position, right? So I think instead of lag, what I want is lead, right? So like the personal consumption is going to go from 1 to 2, right? And then this one, which was private investment, is going to go from 2 to 3, right? And so I think it's the lead that we want. And then for the X end, instead of an NA, the default we want is going to be 5, right? So that gets us our X end, right? And as I think about this, maybe we don't need a separate data element, right? So like maybe we could add this X end in here. And we can get rid of assigning it to data and pipe this. So this should still work because we haven't really changed anything. And we'll come back here, and I'm going to want to put these segments on top of everything, right? Because I want basically this to fill in this black here and here. So let's go ahead and do that after all of our geom segments. We're going to have, I think, 3 or 4 geom segment statements in this one plot, which is kind of cool. All right, geom segment, and then we'll do AES x equals x, x end equals x end, and then y is going to be y end, right? And we'll do color. Well, let's leave it like that. Let's see what it looks like. And so what you can kind of see if we like zoom in, is we've got our segment here, right? And it goes from like, I think this is like 2 to 3. And it's the same color as element 2. I forget what that was. That's the investment, right? So we need that to be black. And we're going to want it to be longer to be the full width of those 2 bars, okay? So let's come back up to our geom segment. We'll do color equals black. And then our x and x end, we're going to want to subtract, we'll do like x adj, and then we'll add x adj. I need to define x adj though, right? And so let's do x adj, and I've already forgotten if I had an underscore. Yes, I have an underscore. My brain. X adj, and let's say like 0.3. I like having these types of parameters that I know I'm going to be fiddling with a lot and that I'm kind of duplicating multiple times up at the top so that I can then algorithmically or programmatically just add that in, right? And so there we go. Cool, right? We now see that we have our black segments at the top. They need to be a little bit longer. And so let's see, I put that to 0.3. Let's take it to 0.4. Okay, we're getting there. Let's take it to 0.45. That's getting there. I think it's just a smidge short, right? You can kind of see that there. So let's take it up to say, let's do 0.46. And zoom in one more time. Still a little short. And so let's go ahead and take that to 0.47. And I think that looks pretty good. You can maybe fine tune that a little bit. So that gets us the caps for everything here, right? So isn't xadj just half of the segment width for the colored segments? Let's see. I think I may have missed a couple other comments. Yeah. So xadj would be half of the segment width, right? So that would have worked great if the line width is something meaningful, but it isn't, right? It's, I think a line width unit of 0.7 is 1 millimeter, or maybe it's 1 millimeter is 0.7, but that doesn't like translate very well to x-axis coordinates. And so that is forcing me to kind of futz with this a little bit. If I had done something like geom rect to draw these rectangles, then I would know the actual positions, right? And so, I don't know. And so it requires some futzing. And as I look at this, I think maybe it's just a hair too long. Let's just take this to like 0.467 and I'll stop worrying about that. Okay, cool. So then the other thing that we need to do though is the first group, right? So let's add another geom segment down here. And so here we're going to do 1 minus that and 1 plus that. And, well, this isn't going to work, is it? So the x position will be 1 minus the adjustment. The n position will be 1 plus the adjustment. And I'm thinking about the y position because we want that to be, well, that's going to be 0, right? So let's make that 0. And that's unhappy. And that's because why? Because I also have y, let's see, 1 minus 1 plus y equals, maybe I want this to be outside of AES. And let's try that. Nope, still unhappy. So it's starting there, and it's going to each of the y ends. So somebody is probably yelling it out there at me. I think we'll have to do y end equals 0 here. That's better. Cool. All right. And if I zoom in, I see that I think that line is a little bit thicker than my x-axis line, right? And so we'll want to fix that. So that geom segment, let's see, my line width here is 0.6. So let's go ahead and do line width equals 0.6. It's still too thick. What was the line width of my geom H line? 0.4. Okay, let's do 0.4. So that maybe this is what Rents was saying about the dark gray. Maybe. So let's see. This segment, this is 0.4. That's black. 0.4 black. It should all work. But that looks a little weird down there. It's not quite the same black. I don't know. Let's make this 0.5. And that's the H line. And then this segment, let's make this 0.5. I think that looks better. Anyway, I don't know. Cool. Okay, so one thing I'm seeing with these arrows, though, is that the lines are a little bit long, right? So Rents is mentioning this, right? And so what I want to do then is I have my arrow going all the way to the top, all the way to the y end. And I think what I'm going to do is do a correction on that y end to basically shrink it a little bit, right? And so I will come back up to this mutate statement, and I will then do, let's do y end arrow, and let's do, like, say 0.9 of y end, okay? And then in the segment with the arrow here, I could do AES y end equals y end arrow, okay? Oh, and I need a closing parenthesis here. All right. And that mostly works, except for when it doesn't work. So let me see, I got a comment here. In Plotly, you would say 0 line false as you are overplotting the y with the 0 black line. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Plotly. That's something I would really like to learn, but I just don't know yet. So it appears, of course, that our arrows go in different directions depending on the size of things. and depending on like the negative sign, right? So let's come back up here to where we did that. Where did I do that? Right here. And let's do if else. So if else y is less than or is greater than 0, then we'll do 0.9 times y end. And actually here I'm going to do arrow ADJ, and let's do 0.95. Get that loaded. And then here, instead of 0.9, we'll do arrow ADJ. And then if it's negative, we'll do, what? It'll be, what? It'll be higher, right? So I think it's going to be like 2 minus arrow ADJ times y end. Oh, and I think, yeah, I forgot a parenthesis here. So you forget a parenthesis in RStudio. If you get a plus sign and a cursor next to it, that's always a little bit disconcerting. So now it's unhappy. Why are you unhappy? So Ren says, could we just rearrange the plotting of the arrows and the segments? The problem is that the arrows are black and the segments are black, so it's always going to look like they're overlapping with each other unless we used a different color. Let's see. So that's Y there. Oh, and it's not Y, it's going to be change. Okay. Okay, I thought I was gaining on it. Let's see. Let's try 0.99. So that's a little bit closer. And as I'm doing this, I'm realizing that by doing it as a proportion, the gap here, this looks like perfect, right? Whereas there's a bigger gap here. And so I think instead of multiplying it, I think I just want to like add or subtract the adjustment factor, okay? So let's try that instead. So let's do 0.01. And then instead of having to worry about multiplying, we could add, or this is going to be a subtraction, right? So it's going to be like y end minus arrow adjustment. And then this could be y end plus arrow adjustment. And that went off the rails. What did I do wrong? This is the point where I'm probably tired. I'm missing something. So here when y equals 0, you have a major grid of gray and an added H line of black, probably with different line widths. That would make sense. That I was perhaps seeing the gray line behind the black line down here. I like your thinking. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, so what am I doing wrong here? So if the change is greater than 0, then I want to subtract the arrow adjustment, but I never probably loaded the arrow adjustment. Much better. Bingo. It's always a little disconcerting when things just magically fall into place like this and work. But I think that's pretty good. I think that's pretty good. I'm not gonna futz with that any further because this is already going a little long. All right, I'll futz it with it just a smidge. So let's do 0.12. All right, I should just do 0.15. All right, I think that's good. Okay, so I'm already running long here, and let's go ahead and add in the annotations instead of messing with that stuff further, okay? I really appreciate you all tuning in for this. I know this is a time commitment for everybody to watch this on their Wednesdays, And I hope you're getting a lot out of this and really enjoy seeing my thought process as well as how I implement it. I really also like the questions that people are asking about what I'm doing or ggplot in general. Okay, so let's start by adding these different labels to the plot, and we can do that. First, I'm going to move this annotate further back up here to after my geom segment. Okay, and just everything works. That's great. And I now, to make these annotations, there's a variety of different ways that we could do this. One thing that I see though is that if we look at like imports, we have imports in bold and it's colored. And then we have surged as and so forth in a black regular font, right? And so that type of mixture works really nicely with a geom rich text. And so geom rich text comes with the GG text package. The other thing that it does is that it has a background color, right? And so we can see how we might use that then to get kind of the break in the grid line by having a white background to our text. So again, I'm going to do that with geom rich text. So we did the caps first, okay, and now the annotations. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to make another tibble. Okay, so we'll do tribble, and then we'll do what? We'll do X, Y, label, and then we'll do not color. Let's start with let's do X, Y, and label, and then let's start with this personal consumption. So I think we're also going to want to add HJust because like these two are right justified and the other three are left justified, right? So let's go ahead in here and add HJust, and that needs a tilde before it. And so for X, and then also we'll make everything vertically justified. So X then would be just to the left of that bar, right? And that X, the X adjustment is basically like 0.5, right? So let's put it at 0.5. And then the Y, let's try like 0.8. And then HJust will be 1. And then here we'll do personal consumption. Okay, so I'm going to do 1, and then we'll go from there. So this is going to be labels. And then in here, down here, we'll go ahead and do geom rich text. And here we'll then do data equals labels, and we'll do inherit.aes equals false. So we have two data tables basically in our plot. And so the inherit AES tells rich text to ignore all this stuff, right? Because we have a different table, we have different column headings and things like that, right? And so then in here, we need to add our own AES. So X is going to be X, Y is going to be Y, label is going to be label, and what? We'll also have color. Actually, the color is going to be baked into the text. So I'm not going to worry about the color, but maybe yeah. So let's start there and go with that. All right, and so there's personal consumption, and nothing special. It looks a lot like geom label at this point, right? Yeah, so I appreciate that comment. Love to have more analysis, more than plots maybe in the future. Yeah, I can think about doing something like that. The nice thing about plots is that it has kind of a defined end that we're trying to get at, but I definitely hear you, like a desire to have more analysis than perhaps just plotting. So now to get like the personal consumption to go over 2 lines and to have the color, we're going to insert into the label HTML. And so we'll do a span and a bold. We could do markdown for the bold, right? We could do 2 stars for bold and then back out the span. And so then in span, we'll do style equals, and then in a single quote, we'll do color colon, and then some hexadecimal, and then some close quote, right? And so like that color is going to be not exactly the same color as the rectangle, okay? So let's bring back our digital color meter and kind of get something close. And we'll plop that in. And there we go. We've got that personal consumption. I forgot to put in the line break though. So let's come back up here. And we can put a line break in with HTML using the BR tag. And so there we go. We've got it going over 2 lines, but we need to bring in our justification, right? And so here in geom-rich text, we also want to add hjust equals hjust, and let's also go ahead and do label.padding equals unit 0 pt, and label.size equals unit 0 pt. And so that then gets us our personal consumption, and yeah, so the font is too big. So let's go ahead and shrink that down. The problem is that like my favorite thing nowadays is being able to use what? I think I had it somewhere in here, right? Where I had label size equals this. And then I could do, or no, it was size and size unit. Unfortunately, we can't do that with geom-rich text. So let's go ahead and add family equals Franklin. But what we could do is like size equals 3. And so 3 is the size of, it's like the plotting size, which is a different size than a font size. Okay, so that shrink it down. Maybe a little bit too small. Let's take that up to say 3.5. And I think that's pretty good. We can probably move it up a little bit. So we did that in our table. So let's take this to like 0.45 and say 0.9. I think I brought it down. Let's take it up. Or did I bring it down? Huh. It's like a 0.95. So that brought it down. Why did it bring it down? Y of 0.95. I wonder if I am... Oh, I have y equals x rather than y equals y. That's why. All right. So that moves it up too far. And let's take this back to 0.8. So I like to get things set for one label before I do everything, so that then I can kind of come through and just clean things up nicely. Let's move that down a little bit more to say 0.7. And that's not perfect, but it's close enough. I'm going to move on for now to do the other labels, right? So the next one down is private investment. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and we'll add that here. And we'll do basically 1 over from this. So it'll be 1.45. And then our Y position, let's do like 3.5. And our H just again is going to be 1. And then we'll plop this in. And we'll do span style equals all the same stuff because it's the same color, right? And then we want the bolded private investment, back out the span. And then we also want a BR for a line break. And then we'll basically do a few line breaks here like that. And let's see what this looks like. Oh, and I think I forgot a line break somewhere. Oh, there's a line break between private and investment, and after the and. All right. And we need another one after the and. And there we go. Cool, right? So we can move it down a bit. So let's do that. And so yeah, I didn't change the vjust. I'd like to change the vjust. So let's go ahead and do vjust. This is probably going to screw up our first one, but that's okay. That's still pretty good. And then this is actually pretty good. One thing I notice that's different between mine and theirs is that with geom-rich text, you get a whole rectangle around the text, right? So like, you'd think that this grid line would come in closer to the I in like it does for theirs. But I've got a rectangle going up and around. So maybe to make it not look so weird, I'm going to bump mine up a little bit so the grid line runs into the in inventories. And so let's take this up to say 3.6. And that's there, but I'm not getting any padding, right? It's running right into it. So I think I did, yeah. So let's make this 2 points. And that's pretty good. Could probably bump everything to the right a smidge. Let's just do 4, 6, 4, 6. Yeah, I'm gonna, let's go. We've made it this far. Let's do 1.48 and 1.48. And then we could perhaps increase the padding, or no, let's go up. Okay, I think it should be 0.5, 1.5. All right, I think I'm probably taxing your all's patience. Okay, I think that's good. Cool. All right, so we've got that private investment in now. You can see that like the size of our fonts are very slightly different. I'm not going to worry about that really here. The next one is government spending, shrank slightly. So hopefully now that we've got those first two worked out, things will go a little bit faster now. And so the X position is going to be aligned on the left side of 3. So it's going to be 3 minus the X adjustment, which was 0.467. So I'm going to do like 2.5 because we also have what? We have the padding, right? And then the Y is going to be like, let's say 4.4. And this is going to be left justified, so we'll do 0. And then we'll do span, style, color, colon, something, semicolon, back out. Just kind of get everything in here. And that government spending goes over 2 lines, so we'll do a break in there. And then here we'll back out of the span, but that's outside of the quote. Get that inside the quote, and then shrink slightly is on a separate line. So that needs a BR also. And so now we need to get the color of that purple. Where'd you go? Grab that. Plop that in. Oh, it's not happy about that. So I bolded it, but it didn't. Oh, I forgot a close quote here. Okay. That's close. let's move it up a bit and see if we can get it above that grid line. And so the Y is 4.4. Let's go to 4.6. That's too far. And I think I did 4.64, but let's do 4.5. And that brings it down. And that's basically what they've got, right? Like they've got shrink slightly covering up the grid line, which we have. Cool. See, it goes a little bit faster. Now let's do exports. And I'm going to copy and paste this down and change this to be exports. And then we don't need the rest of this. Okay. The color is going to be different, of course. And we need a comma here. And so it's 1 over. So there should be 3.5. And then it's going to be maybe like 4.8. And so we've got the wrong color, of course. But let's make it 4.95. I forgot that it's vertically justifying it. So let's do 4.9. Oh, we can go more. That's cool. But now we need to change the color, right? And that's that orangish, darker orange color. And substitute that in. And voila, right? Cool. All right. We're in the home stretch here. We're getting there. Don't worry, folks. Could you get the 3.6 and the 5 from the data tribble instead of explicitly writing it out? Yeah, you could. You could. Although, as I'm kind of finding, there's... You mean like the 3.6 and the 5 and the negative 0.3? Yeah, you could totally do that using like the glue package, right? That is a great point. Normally I would do that, but we're almost approaching 2 hours here, so I don't want to tax everyone's patience. But we could totally do that, and that's a good idea. Let's let's see. So I'm going to copy this down again because we got the same color, and so we need this. And plop that in. And so like, so imports is bolded and then surged as a BR, and then businesses tried to get and then ahead of tariffs. Okay. All right. So now we need to get a comma at the end here, and we need to get the position right? And so this then is maybe 2 over, right? So maybe it should be 5.5 and should be like 2.8. Bam. Awesome. I'm thinking like my font might be a little bit too big. Also, we've got the orange text, so we want to correct that. I think that's because I forgot to close the span here. Okay. I forgot to save it. There we go. Right. Cool. And I like having mine, again, this is mine above the grid line, so I don't have to worry about that grid line, but you could play with that. Okay, we have one more to do, which is this overall change. And if you stick around, Rents, because you are hanging out, I will try to not hard code these values. So sit tight and we'll see if we can do that for you. So this is going to be 4.5, and then we're going to be at like a negative 0.5, I think. And then this color is going to be black, which is 6 zeros. And then we'll say well, negative 0.3 overall BR change. You need a comma at the end of this line and get rid of all this other text. Okay, so I think I did 0.3 rather than negative 0.5. Where were you? Yeah. So that's a little bit too far down. So let's take it up to, say, maybe negative 0.35. Bam. Cool. So this is the plot, right? Kind of off the side of the screen. And subtle differences in the size of fonts that I'm not going to get too worried about, but we've recreated it. Awesome. And we did it in under 100 lines of code. So the thing that Rents was asking about is that, let's check that off, that in this text, there's a few numbers like 3.6, 5, 0.3, negative 0.3, right? So like if we wanted to rerun this on the updated data, right? So the data that they posted at the end of May, I think it was, or earlier. Yeah, end of May, I believe, was revised. And I think this may have gone to like negative 0.2, right? So how would we bring in new data, but not have to like change everything, right? And so let's think about that. So I think what I would do is I'm going to then go ahead and take the data here, and I've already done this once, right? So I'll call that data, and I'm going to cut that out, and then I'll come up here and do data equals that, right? And so for data, I have this. And so like the three numbers that I want are, well, let's start with this like negative 0.3, right? And so what I need to do is to use R to get like the overall decrease, right? So if we do data, and then we do, what? So that's going to be change, right? So if we do data $sign change, that will get us that column. And we can do sum on data $sign change. That gets us negative 0.28. They rounded, right? So we could then, we could round that to 1 digit to get negative 0.3, right? And so this will be like overall drop equals that. And we could then take overall drop and we could then do glue on this. So glue is a lot like the paste or paste zero function, but it's a lot easier to use. And so then what we could do is right here, instead of this number, we could do overall drop in curly braces. And I can't find glue because I have to load library glue. And it's there, right? And so if you don't believe me, that did what we thought it did, maybe we could like round this to 2 digits and we get the negative 0.28, right? So let's do 1. So that's one number, right? And so now we have two other numbers that we could do the same thing with, right? And let's see, the imports push down by 5 percentage points, right? And so now we can do we'll do like import drop, right? And so we'll again do data $change, or let's do data, and that is going to be imports, right? So again, we could do like filter data category equals imports, right? And then we could then do pull on change, right? And then we could do round 1. And that gets us -5, right? So this could be, like I said, import drop. And then where'd I have that 5%? Right here, right? And so we'll do in curly brace import drop. But of course I need to wrap this in glue before the parenthesis. And there's our 5 inserted now. And again, if you don't believe me, we could change that 5 to a 4. And now we see it goes to 4 percentage points, right? And that also this number changes, right? Which is kind of cool. All right, and then the final one that we want to do is private investment was up 3.6, right? So then we could do investment increase, and I think it's going to be the same thing I had here, right? But instead of imports, I think it's private investment. And so then if I look at investment increase, it's going to be 3.6. And yeah, we'll do the same thing here. We'll do glue. And then right here, this 3.6 we'll replace with investment increase. And there you go. We've got that 3.6 baked in. Okay. So, and this didn't get updated. Maybe because I didn't rerun this. Okay, let's try this again. Rerunning everything. There you go. This is what we expected, right? So this is the plot. I'm not going to do it because time is short. I'm just at 2 hours right now. But, you know, we've got a plot that we could, I think, fairly easily update for Q2 or for modifications in Q1, right? And yeah, and so again, this is a waterfall chart showing kind of the overall contributions of different factors to a overall statistic. Let's show mine. I don't want to show theirs anymore. And I think we've done a pretty good job of recreating the original plot. The highlights, at least for me, were making these floating rectangles using geom segment, but making the lines really thick, getting those arrows with the arrowheads, not going too far into those caps, adding the caps, adding the annotation we saw, and then kind of all the other ggplot theming types of things that we always do. So on the whole, I thought this was pretty cool. I think this is a better plot than kind of the side-by-side bar plot that we saw from the original Bureau of Economic Analysis web page. But play with this. I'd be curious what people find use for a waterfall chart for in their own applications. I've seen it mainly with like economic type of data, but I could see it being used for lots of different applications. And so it'd be cool to see where you are using it. All right. Well, this was, sorry, Rents. You should move the minus in 5 ppt. good eye, because it's saying it's a drop, right? So it's a drop. So clearly it's negative. And so what I would do for that, that's the import drop, right? -5. I would then do abs. And that absolute value gets rid of that hyphen. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to break here. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and sticking with this episode. I really hope you've learned a lot. As I have said a couple times throughout today's episode, down below you will find a link to the blog post describing what I did here. Also a link for where you can register for my newsletter. And you will also see a link for the code to recreate what I had done here. And I would really encourage you to take that code and use it for your own applications. Please tell your friends about what we're doing here on Code.